Okay, I think the stream started. So today I want to talk about pipelines. What are they and why are they on Acquia? You may have heard it's a private beta right now, but Acquia just released a new product called pipelines. It's kind of a buzzwordy term that you hear a lot now lately as well. Everyone has a pipeline involved in their application in some way or another. So to start off with, I'd like to give a little bit of perspective of why this is important now and why you should care. In a previous talk, I talked about Doxel and how that's changing how we do some local development. And so in this case, I want to talk about pipelines and how they're changing our release cycle for products. So in this case, here's the old way of how we did DevOps, or some cases, some people still do this, but you shouldn't be. We would have a local environment set up here. So we have a VM or XAMPP or WAMP, whatever system you're working with. And so you would do some changes to your site locally, and then you would use FTP to move files that you change to your live site, which is not very good because there's no review process and you can break your site like right away just by changing a file. So the new way that we're doing things, so we have a local environment set up. A lot of cases we're using Vagrant. We're also using Doxel, which we talked about in a previous talk. So I'll do some changes on my local environment. I'll see what those look like on my local site. And then I'll use a VCS, a version control system. We usually default, at least on our site, to GitHub. There's also Bitbucket, GitLab. There's a couple other solutions out there for using version control. But the idea behind version control is that I can see exactly the changes I made to my code. I can put those up for other people to see, and I can revert back to previous versions. At that point, we're usually passing our code to some sort of CI or continuous integration service. I've used Circle CI. We also use Jenkins. There's quite a few other ones that are out there, but those are the two ones that I'm most familiar with. Typically, when we push to version control or create a pull request or something like that, usually when we're messing with version control, the way it's set up right now is that'll usually trigger an action into our CI server and say, okay, we need to do some sort of action because code has changed. At that point, our continuous integration server should look at our code, say, okay, everything looks good, or some tests failed and you need to take a look at this, anything like that. If everything passes, then it goes to our live environment, which could be Acquia, could be Heroku, could be any sort of service out there. So that's what DevOps looks like today. We have these two added steps here instead of FTP that make sure that our code quality is good, that our site doesn't break, and that we're not going to get angry phone calls from clients. So I want to kind of interject for a quick second. If you haven't heard of this software development methodology, there's I guess there's this methodology called the 12-factor app. It talks about how for an application you're developing, there's 12 different factors that have essentially been seen over time as factors that make a stable app and a really stable release cycle, and things that in software development we generally try and strive for. There's a link here if you guys wanted to check that out. But for the two steps I just talked about, the version control and CI, there's sort of three different steps or three different factors in that methodology that they touch on and I want to talk about. First one is code base, and the idea that you have one code base tracked in revision control for your app, and that you're able to conduct many deploys. So instead of just deploying a file, you're deploying the state of your app every time. Number two is dependencies. So we explicitly declare and isolate dependencies, just meaning that we don't have code that came from some Stack Overflow question that I don't really know where it comes from or why it's there or anything like that. We're also not taking packages of code from outside in the internet and just throwing it into our site and expecting that it's always going to be there. We're always declaring what exactly our site depends on and what it needs. But then the last one, and this one's probably most important for us these days, is build, release, and run. Whoops, sorry for the typo here. But the general idea is that we should be able to build our app, which means we're pulling in all of our dependencies. We release it, which means we state that this is one version of our app that's ready to go. And then we run it, which means we put it on a production environment so everyone can see it. So how does that relate to a pipeline? A pipeline is essentially trying to take care of a lot of those concerns. So In this case, we have our version control and our continuous integration. If I wanted to say, what is a pipeline is, at least in my opinion, the best definition would be a combination of version control and continuous integration, some system that handles those things. So as soon as I hand code off to a system and say, this is my new version of code, then it goes through a pipeline of making sure that everything works properly and gets released. If we look back at that 12-factor app, we have VCS kind of controls the code base requirement. And then we usually have a build process during our CI that will build our code and pull in all the dependencies. And then we have a release, which means that if everything passed in CI, then we created a new release of our app. It's code that's new and ready to go. So what does that look like right now on Acquia? At least for some of the most of the development workflows I've been involved in, here's sort of what reality looks like. So we'll be using a local, and in this case, I'm using Doxel, and so I'll push code to our version control system, which is GitHub in most cases. At that point, I'll have some CI service, which is generally will be Circle CI or Jenkins. It's going to look at it and make sure that it at least passes some really basic sanity checks, like config doesn't conflict with each other, or I don't have some PHP parser or something like that. And then my continuous integration server contacts GitHub and says, code looks good. And then I go look at GitHub and say, okay, the code looks good, so I can merge it. But then at that point, the code really only exists, the merge code only exists in GitHub or on my local. And so the kind of funny step that we've had before is I'd have to pull it down on my local and then push that over to our live environment, which is Acquia. Acquia also uses a version control system. So in this case, I have to keep these two version control systems in sync, which is a manual task that we don't really like. It kind of conflicts with the 12-factor app principles in that I can't just release the software as soon as I know that it's good to go. Instead, I have this manual step of I have to pull down the working version of the software and push it back up, which we don't like. So what does Acquia Pipelines do? I realized that I made these boxes a little big, so that's why my diagram looks kind of funny. But so same process here. I'll be working on my local. I'll push that to my version control system. My version control system is still going to notify my continuous integration server and say, hey, run some tests. Let me know if this works. But at the same time, my version control system, which is GitHub, is now going to send a notification to Acquia as well and say, hey, I got some new code push. You should check this out. And what Pipelines is going to do is listen for those requests. And then as soon as it sees it, it says, okay, what branch or version of code were you working on? And then it's going to run some process on that code, take the results of the different actions that it takes on that code, and then put that inside of Acquia Git instead. So rather than me having to pull the code back from version control and push it myself to Acquia, Acquia now has a pipelines product that sits in the middle and will listen to version control, and as soon as the code is updated, it moves it to Acquia for me, which is really nifty. It's part of a regular release cycle. I don't have to do any manual steps. If I know code works and I merge it on GitHub, then I know it's going to get pushed out to my site, which is better than before. So really quickly, I'll go into some caveats that I found. And then I'll walk through how Pipelines actually works and how to set it up on a project. So the first one is that you can use GitHub, which is really nice because that solves the hardest problem for us. On previous projects, I had to use CI to essentially check for when code works and then push that over to Acquia, but then I'm giving my CI server access to Acquia, which isn't really ideal because my CI server then can control my live environment product, which I don't really want to happen. And it was kind of a mess of Git to get those things working. We also use Jenkins for that purpose a lot, but you can argue whether or not that's ideal. So the first one is that you can use GitHub, but the permissions are kind of hard. So I'll show you, if you're really curious about pipelines, you want to go check out some docs right now. There's docs.acquia.com/pipelines, and you can see a lot of information here. The caveat that I was mentioning is for any repositories that are owned by an organization, the person that originally sets up the GitHub role in pipelines, meaning that you're establishing that first connection between GitHub and pipelines, that person has to be an owner inside of your organization, which is it's essentially person who can do anything inside of your GitHub organization except change your billing information. So for probably smaller shops or something like that, that's not really an issue. But when you start to get an organization that has like over 400 people, it can be kind of hard if you have someone trying to start up a project and then they have to be owner over the entire organization. So that was just a little caveat I found, and especially if you decide that you really want to try out pipelines and you go and set it up, just know that whoever at least runs this first command, this init GitHub, to establish that link, they have to be an owner in your organization. So anyway, just something that took me a little while to figure out, and then when I discovered it, it was something I found noteworthy.
Would an owner be like a colleague?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So number 2 was the branch must exist in Acquia Git to manually trigger a build. So let me go ahead and see if I can switch over to my terminal. And so I'm also trying to switch over the screen share on Google. Maybe this will work better. It's an awkward pause. Okay, here we can see that. So I'm just going to run git status. You can see what site I'm working on. So right now, you can see I'm on upstream dev. So pipelines, when you first set up for pipelines, you'll get a link to install like a binary that you can run on your system. And by default, it's just pipelines. And so I can call pipelines, and then I get all sorts of stuff that I can start using. I can configure the particular app I'm in right now, or I can. There's a whole bunch of stuff. The most common ones that you'll usually use is init GitHub when you're first setting up, and that's the one that establishes the link between GitHub and pipelines. The other one is list applications. That'll show you all of your sites that you have in Acquia. They each have an application ID, which wasn't super easy to find from the UI, but with pipelines you can do that, and it'll say what the site name is next to application ID, which is really nifty. And then probably the next common one is going to be list jobs and status. So list jobs will tell you everything that pipelines is doing. So every time it gets a notification from GitHub, it's going to start a job. You can see all the jobs that I've run. And then status is going to tell you what the status is of the last job that occurred. So in this case, let's see, I'm just going to create a new branch, and we'll call it AP demo. So I'm sitting on this AP demo branch right now. So the first caveat is that it has the branch has to exist in Acquia's Git first for it to be able to build a pipeline from my command line. So the big selling point of pipelines for us right now is that I can create the branch on GitHub, and then Acquia is going to see that and create the branch in Acquia for me automatically. You can also trigger this manually from the command line, but you'll just need to make sure that that branch exists first. I can run pipeline start, and it's going to tell Acquia, okay, go build the AP-demo branch, which you think it would start to work, but if I go to list jobs here, then we'll see that the status, whoops. Well, it's going to take a second to figure out that it's not working. So we get this error here that this VCS path wasn't found, which just means that it couldn't find that branch anywhere that it looked. So that is so that's one caveat with the with pipelines, is that you have to make sure that at least if you want to trigger builds manually, that you are you have a branch that's existing on Acquia already.
Now, I would imagine it still works if you, let's say you made changes to a branch that didn't exist, and then you push those to GitHub, and then somebody merged that branch with a branch that did exist.
Yeah. If you make changes to a branch that already exists in Acquia, pipelines will see that, and then it will update pipelines itself, or sorry, the built branch itself. So I guess that's caveat number 3, and we'll kind of go into a little bit more details of how pipelines works here as a result. But it's important to note that build artifacts are committed to a build branch. So normally when we think of a release process, we think of tags. That's how we've done on a lot of sites, where you have a very, very explicit, here's the exact state of the code during this release. With pipelines, instead, it puts everything in this pipelines-build- whatever your first branch name was, but it creates a whole branch based off of that. So it's kind of nice because on the one hand, I can deploy an environment to like pipelines-dev, and then anytime I merge something, I know that branch is going to get updated with the build code. The downside is that it's going to be a little bit difficult to revert things from the UI if you push out some branch that for whatever reason like breaks your site, which ideally, since we're already doing continuous integration and all that, we're checking for those things, but it's just something to note.
When you say build artifacts, so it's not using a git commit is the point for the code. It's taking whatever the state your code base is after you run compose and all that other stuff, and like basically has it in like a folder. I don't know what's going on their end, but it's different than a git commit.
Oops. Yeah, let me pull that up real quick. And we'll kind of look at what the whole process looks like.
And if this is part of your next few slides, and just continue.
No, that's fine. So let's take a look here. I can see I'm back on that AP demo branch. So what I can do is I guess for my next trick, I'm just going to create this, maybe just a basic test file here. So I'll add test, and then I can, we'll just call this maybe a demo commit or something like that. Okay, so I have a commit. I know that I'm one commit ahead of dev. What I can do is create a pull request here. And hopefully this works. Oh, that's not good. 1 sec. Oh, I know what it is. So I have a couple of remotes here. I'm going to push this to origin, which is my fork of my parent repo, and I'm going to call that demo. Acquia pipelines by default, at least what I found, is I can push the branch to the actual repo that I used when I called init GitHub, and Acquia can read all of those just fine. What it seems to have issues with, and I don't know if they may have fixed this because they seem to be doing a lot of changes to pipelines as they're building this, but it will now recognize if I build a pull request and create a build branch for that particular pull request. So what I'll do in this case is now, hopefully this will work. So I'll call dev here. Yeah. Okay, so I created a pull request on GitHub. So now if I go back to list jobs, and hopefully it's starting. So it's running in progress. One thing you'll notice that at least I noticed here is we have this pipelines build-pr-dev. So what pipelines is doing lately is it'll take the most recent pull request and build a branch based off that pull request, which is kind of nifty. When I first started using this, none of my pull requests would pass because Acquia didn't have access to my code that lived in my fork, and instead would just fail every time. So there was no way really to see what my code was going to look like on, say, a development environment in Acquia prior to actually merging the code. Now in this case, it'll take whatever the most recent pull request was, compile that code so I could technically deploy my dev environment to this PR branch. And then anytime that someone creates a pull request, I can immediately see what those changes are going to be on Acquia without needing some other system. Usually we'll use something like Jenkins to have those different build environments that we can review things in before they're merged. With Acquia pipelines, you'd still probably want that. It doesn't really solve that problem, and I think it's really intended to solve that problem, but you at least can get it for the most recent pull requests. So for a simple like maybe a really small SLA site or something like that, if you don't have a lot of big work going on all the time, you could deploy to something like this branch, and then you get those, get to see that stuff immediately. But what I'll do right now is we'll fetch Acquia. And Nathan, just to answer your question. Oh boy, might take a little while. So I guess really quickly while it's running, I'll show you the only thing that you need for Acquia pipelines is one, talk to Acquia because they have to enable it for your site. Two, you need this pipelines.yaml file, which as you can see is pretty short. Acquia Pipelines is based off of events, but right now there's only one event, and that's build. And then for different steps, there's only one step type, and it's script. So I'm sure they have plans for many other features, but right now, like it's a very basic setup of kind of how to get this going. So when the build event occurs, which means pipeline sees a new code that needs to build, it's going to come in and run these steps, which as you can see right now, all we're doing is installing Composer modules, and then we're running npm install, which I have set up for some of our front end stuff. So anytime pipeline sees a new code change, it's going to run these two things, and that makes sure that my dependencies are being pulled in, which is nice as well because I have to declare those dependencies. Because if, say, I add some contrib module to my site, my local, and I forget to add it to Composer or something like that, then the build's going to fail on CI because that module won't exist. With pipelines, I can make sure that all those modules are still there, which just kind of, we used to have a workflow where you'd add all of your vendor, all your contrib modules to your code base, and then you end up with these gigantic code bases that have stuff that's just pulling from online.
And you were kind of forced to with the way Acquia worked.
Right.
They didn't really have an option to run Composer build steps
Right.
as part of your deployments.
So now I can, if I need to update a module, I update one line in my composer.json, commit that, and then Acquia is going to go and update all the code for me, which is a pretty neat feature. It saves some time for us, and more importantly, it makes sure that we have a very stable and expected deployment process. I don't need to make sure that certain files are not being excluded or get ignored or something like that. It's just going to be there. So for actually setting up pipelines, contact Acquia, add this file to your project, and you're pretty much good to go. Okay, let's see if this is working. And so just to answer your question, what you ultimately get in the end. So I'll look at maybe build dev. So as you can see, because it's using that branch type workflow and not tags, it's actually creating a commit every time it sees a new update to your code base, and just commits with whatever the job ID it generated was.
Oh, okay.
So if I wanted to, I could revert a commit. I can't go back in a tag in the UI, which was just kind of nifty in some cases. But in theory, since we have that CI before Acquia in our pipeline, we're not going to run into those issues. So I know that's, I guess, at a high level, what Acquia Pipelines is and what it does for you. It's been really nice for us just because I don't have to deal with like managing, doing a lot of code management that I had to before with CI, just because Acquia lives in Git. But instead now I set up pipelines. I run pipelines in GitHub. It starts watching my repo, and then as I'm creating pull requests or as I'm merging code, it's automatically updating the code on my server with all the dependencies. That said, any questions right now? Lindsay, nothing?
Nothing on my end, but I can understand like why this makes sense to implement in projects. It seems like it would make your life a lot easier instead of having to contact or look at GitHub and pull that down. It just doesn't.
Right.
Yeah, just to show you real.
We're doing a lot of this stuff already with CI box, but a lot of it's just we're using Jenkins to run scripts to do what Acquia Pipelines is doing. So
Yeah, and on some projects though, where we're not doing any kind of CI, I've seen us have GitHub and Acquia Git And I've seen those two get out of sync with each other. Because
Oh.
someone will get on the project and start committing directly to Acquia, not to GitHub, and make a mess out of everything.
Yeah, in this case, you can't really do that because that has been, it's nice that Acquia has Git because you can do that sort of revisioning and roll back your site really quickly. On the downside, you've had two sources of truth in your project all the time. With pipelines, you're getting rid of that. So in this case, I can't commit. I mean, I guess I technically could commit directly to the branch, but you'd have to really know that you need to commit directly to that branch versus just being able to manage everything in GitHub. And then we no longer even care about Git in Acquia. So I was just going to show as an example when I run, or I guess when I commit code. So I have this composer.json file, and so these are, it's really hard to see on the screen. So these are just a bunch of contrib modules that I'm using in my site. If I needed to, for example, update this, I can just literally update that file or that line right there, save it, push it, and then Acquia is going to go out and fetch all those dependencies for me. So that's been kind of nice. And this is, as you can probably imagine, a lot of code that would be sitting inside of our repo that isn't actually something I care about. And that's sort of the other big reason why we like having our dependencies declared and not included in version control, is because when I go to our repo, I only want to see the things that are relevant to me that I'm going to be working on. And with this, that's what I get. When I go to GitHub, I only see the code that we've created and we've built and we want to change. I don't have to deal with like figuring out if this Drupal libraries module is something that I need to like look at when I'm in GitHub. So it cuts down on, well, I think a little bit on code review time and getting onboarded because there's just significantly less stuff to look at. Yeah, cool. Well, if that's it, I'll stop the recording.